Pretty gentleman.
We have.
As you can see, she looked at me like, yeah, and?
We can share pictures. That's Carmen.
Startup, a nonprofit Who We Are project, and yeah, a film on Netflix, and having my husband say, when do you get a paycheck? I don't recommend people in their 50s and 60s quit their day jobs to do a startup. But I keep following them, and it's the right kind of work to do. So, and it helps definitely in trying times. I'm like, I don't need to have an individual conversation with an idiot. I'm just going to try to change the minds of millions.
Speaking of which, that scene in which he did that, I mean, I just really admire his character.
I haven't, but I'm tonight's discussion on such an important issue that persistently harms our societies, and that is racism. We are so delighted to welcome attorney and activist Jeffery Robinson to the United Nations so we can delve together into his film titled, as you see here, Who We Are, A Chronicle of Racism in America. Jeffery founded the Who We Are project to show, among other things, how slavery's legacy has led to persistent and abiding racial inequality, as well as to promote education, discourse, and change. I'm really delighted also that today's event has been co-sponsored by the United States Mission to the United Nations, and we are honored to have here with us tonight Desiree Cormier Smith. You want to stand up and wave? Who is, and now you'll really clap because she is the U.S. Department of State's first ever Special Representative for Racial Equality and Justice. As the United States is the United Nations host country, we've always placed great value on relations between Washington, D.C. and our organization by working together to combat injustice and to promote inclusion. We all know that we can make a difference if we do come together. And so the creation of the Special Representative's position and her presence here tonight demonstrates a strong commitment to addressing the stranglehold that racism continues to have in our world. My department, the Department of Global Communications, manages the United Nations outreach program on the transatlantic slave trade and slavery. This program was created by the General Assembly in 2007 to educate the public about the history of the transatlantic slave trade in enslaved Africans, but also its present-day legacies, including racism and prejudice. Although, as we know, slavery was officially abolished centuries ago, we are still living with its devastating effects. Chains that were once literal have become figurative, but they are chains nonetheless. Structures that developed and solidified over 400 years of forced human trafficking and labor remain entrenched in our societies. So as communicators and also educators, our job is to shine a light on the situation as it truly exists, so that we can have honest conversations about how we can move forward together. I'm proud to say that my team also manages communications around the International Decade for People of African Descent, which runs through 2024. The United Nations launched this decade almost 8 years ago to promote the respect, protection, and fulfillment of human rights for people of African descent worldwide. It also fosters greater respect for the diverse heritage, culture, and contributions of Black communities. Around 200 million people in the Americas identify themselves as being of African descent, whether as descendants of the victims of the transatlantic trade in enslaved Africans or as more recent migrants. They all too often experience discrimination, and they all too often face discrimination in their access to justice. They face alarmingly high rates of police violence and racial profiling, and their degree of political participation is often low, both in voting and in occupying political positions. So today's discussion will highlight some of these worrying trends. Dear friends, last year marked the 20th anniversary of the Durban Declaration and Program of Action. That is the United Nations blueprint to combat racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and related intolerance globally. It recognizes that no country can claim to be free of racism, and that racism is a global concern, and that tackling it requires universal effort. So here at the United Nations, I want to also say that we are not only looking outwards, we are taking a look at ourselves as well. Our Secretary General has acknowledged that systemic racism is, unfortunately, also present within the United Nations in its own halls. And he and all of us are committed to action that will guarantee the equal treatment of all United Nations staff and zero tolerance for any racist behavior within our ranks. And in that regard, the United Nations Office of the Ombudsman and Mediation Services has developed dialogues to create safe spaces for participants to engage in perspectives and experiences relating to racism in our workplace. They've convened 50 dialogue sessions for some 2,000 participants. And really, it is a goal to examine our own work culture and ensure inclusion. I mean, we have to represent, each and every one of us, what we are trying to ask the rest of the world to do. So we all have a duty, we at the United Nations and everyone, and thank you all for coming here, really, because it shows that you are all committed in our quest to stamp out racism. We don't have to be leaders or policymakers to do our part, and my hope is that today you will learn more, and I think learning more is part of it. It's a step. Education. I think some of us, what we see so much is just ignorance, but we need to learn more about racist structures that really are holding our societies back. And we hope that you will feel inspired, I'm sure, by our guests, by Jeffrey. And now it is my pleasure to invite the U.S. State Department Special Representative for Racial Equality and Justice, Desiree Cormier-Smith.
Thank you so much. Good evening. I'm Desiree Cormier-Smith, and in June of this year, U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken appointed me as the State Department's first ever Special Representative for Racial Equity and Justice. In this historic new role, I'm focused on advancing racial and ethnic equity and justice globally through U.S. foreign affairs work. It is my job to ensure that U.S. foreign policy, programs, and processes protect and advance the respect for the human rights of persons belonging to marginalized racial and ethnic communities, including indigenous peoples and people of African descent, and that we are working to counter systemic racism, discrimination, and xenophobia around the world. My position exists because while we acknowledge the very real and ongoing challenges we are facing here in the United States to fully address the long and lingering legacies of the displacement of Native Americans and the enslavement of Africans and their descendants, we also recognize that these challenges are not unique or exclusive to the United States. Structural racism, discrimination, and xenophobia are global scourges that require global solutions. The United States seeks to be a positive and productive member of a global community working to address racial and ethnic inequities as a means to a more just and peaceful world. And we are trying to show our commitment not by the example of our power, but by the power of our example, by doing the hard but necessary work to address systemic racism here in the United States openly and honestly. Now, part of that work means acknowledging and addressing the ways in which anti-Black racism and the global devaluation of Black lives has plagued our world for centuries. African descendant communities around the world are still grappling with the devastating and lingering impacts of the transatlantic slave trade and colonialism. Though a concept founded on a fallacious premise, it is undeniable that white supremacy's global legacy is one that is deep, systemic, complex, and violent. I came across Who We Are a few months ago while watching Netflix on a random Saturday, well before I knew I would have the opportunity and the privilege of being here with Jeffery Robinson today. After seeing the short preview on Netflix, I knew I needed to watch this film. As a practitioner of racial justice work, but also as an American, I immediately recognized Who We Are as required watching. And not to spoil the plot, but one of the things that Jeffery says in the documentary that has stuck with me since, and I'm paraphrasing here, is something along the lines of, countries, like human beings, can be many things at once. Just as no person is purely a saint or purely a sinner, neither is any nation. That stuck with me because it is so true but rarely acknowledged. Like people, all countries have parts of their histories they can and should be proud of, but there are also undoubtedly dark chapters in our histories that we wish we could change. But wishing them away doesn't negate the fact that they happened, nor the fact that we are still grappling with the lingering legacies of many of those ugly historical events. Many things can be true. America is a great nation, but we are a great nation whose original sin was the enslavement of Africans stolen from their homeland and the displacement of Native Americans who were here long before European colonizers arrived. And as President Biden often says, great nations do not shirk from their past. And I would add to that, nor do they shirk from their present. This is why it is important that we understand that the United States is not exempt from this complicated legacy of white supremacy. In fact, our country, my country, has at times played an integral role in perpetuating white supremacy, both domestically and globally. None of us are pure saints or pure sinners. As we gather here this evening in the beautiful halls of the United Nations, where decisions impacting global stability and peace are made by the most powerful people in the world, I want to acknowledge that we are on the ancestral lands of the Lenape people, which stretched from New York City to New Jersey, parts of eastern Pennsylvania, and Delaware. I also want to acknowledge that we are only a few blocks away from Seneca Village, a historic community founded by free Blacks in 1825. This middle-class community provided sanctuary and safe haven for many Black people following New York's abolition of slavery in 1827. And that thriving community was destroyed by city officials several decades later, homes demolished, hundreds of people forcibly displaced to make room for what we now know as Central Park. Who We Are reminds us of the power of remembrance of communities like Seneca Village, gone but never forgotten. It is so important to remember so that we can better understand how we got to where we are today and to prevent us from making those same mistakes. This incredibly insightful and informative documentary could not be more timely or more relevant. I applaud the directors, Emily and Sarah Kunstler, as well as the man of the hour, Jeffery Robinson, for spearheading such a thoughtful and substantive analysis of who we are as Americans, who we have been, and who we have the potential to be. The Biden-Harris administration is committed to taking steps to begin to right past wrongs, understanding that we are indeed at a tipping point, not only here in the United States, but as a global community. Marginalized racial and ethnic communities around the world are joining in what can only be described as a global reckoning on inequities and injustice. This anti-racist work is urgent. We have the opportunity in front of us to create a more just, a more equitable, and a more peaceful world. Not only is it the morally right thing to do, but it's also in our shared security interest. Societies that successfully address deep-rooted disparities tend to be more peaceful, more prosperous, and more stable, and that is good for us all. I'm honored to serve with my colleagues at the State Department to work towards a more just world where all people are valued and included, and no one is prevented from living up to their full potential simply because of their race or ethnicity. James Baldwin once said, "Not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced." The history and legacy of racism, particularly anti-Black racism, here in the United States and around the world can be uncomfortable to face head-on. But the United States can, the United States must, and we are trying to do just that. Thank you.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Jeffery Wyatt. I am the chief of the Education Outreach Section, which is housed in the Department of Global Communications, and our team, which oversees the Remember Slavery program, has organized tonight's event, and in a few minutes, we'll have an opportunity to have a discussion with Jeff. But first, it is my pleasure to give the floor to Mr. Jeffery Robinson for his introductory remarks. Please join me in welcoming him.
It is a pleasure and honor and a thrill for me to be in this building for the first time in my life. I have walked past it many times, but to be in this building for this reason on this night is incredibly special for me. I knew I was going to be a criminal defense lawyer from the time I was 11 years old. I grew up in Memphis, Tennessee. I was born in 1956. And in March of 1968, when I was 11 years old, there was a strike among sanitation workers in Memphis, Tennessee. And Martin Luther King Jr. came to our city to lead a demonstration in support of those striking workers. And that demonstration on the 28th broke into violence, and there were a bunch of people that ended up being arrested. And my dad, who was a high school principal, took me to one of the court hearings because some of the people who were arrested were like ministers and people in my community that I'd been brought up to respect. And I saw these lawyers apparently coming out of nowhere and representing people and talking about the right to protest. And I was amazed. And I asked my father, how do you get to be one of them? And he said, well, you know, he was an educator, so right away he went to school. You got to get good grades in high school, and I'm thinking that ain't going to happen. And then you got to go to college, and then you got 3 years of law school, and I'm adding this up thinking I'll be 26 by the time I graduate. I'll be an old man. But from the time I saw that court hearing, I was destined to be a criminal defense lawyer. And if you work in the criminal legal system in America, you will deal with the issue of anti-Black racism. And I was dealing with that issue when I went to Marquette University and when I went to Harvard Law School. And I became a public defender at the state and federal level, and then I went into private practice, fighting these issues of racial justice in our criminal legal system. And then about 2011, because of an incident that's kind of described in the film, but a tragedy in my family, my wife and I became parents for the first time, and our son was 13 years old and fresh out of Queens, New York, moving to Seattle, Washington, and asking questions like, what do I do if the police roll up on me? And I had to answer those questions. And as I started to answer them, I heard the words that my father told me in the 1960s about how to survive as a young Black man when you're confronted with police officers. And I felt like throwing up, because as I said those words and realized that they were the same words my father said to me, I also remembered my father saying to me, and this is the same thing my father told me in the 1930s. And I thought, how long does this go on? And I started looking for help to raise my now 13-year-old son. And I didn't find much, but what I found when I was looking was all kinds of information about the history of anti-black racism in America, information that I had never been taught, despite having one of the best educations in America. And one of the things that I was trained to do as a criminal defense lawyer is that if you have a complicated set of facts, put it into a timeline just to see what will happen. And when I did that, the top of my head came off, because I saw an unbroken line from at least 1619 to today. An unbroken line of anti-black racism that answers the question, why are you talking about those things that happened so long ago? And the answer is, number one, some of it wasn't so long ago, and number two, as George Orwell said so ominously, who controls the past controls the future. If you control the narrative on why America and the world looks like it does today, if you control that narrative, then you control the narrative of what we're going to do in the future, because you control the explanation of why things look the way they do today. And if that explanation is based on a myth, is based on less than the full truth, then by definition, we will be heading someplace that's not where we intend to head. The only way we can live up to what we claim to want to be is to tell the truth about how we got here. So I started going around the country giving a 3-hour presentation on the history of anti-black racism in America. And people would come to me and say, can't you do it in 45 minutes? And I would say, no, I can't. So if you don't have the time, I understand. But if you want me to tell this story, it's going to take a minute. And in 2017, I gave this presentation to a bunch of federal judges and lawyers right here in Manhattan in the federal district courthouse, which, by the way, there are hundreds of enslaved people buried beneath the fricking federal courthouse in Manhattan. One of the people in the room when I gave this lecture was a lawyer named Sarah Kunstler. And she and her sister, Emily Kunstler, are brilliant filmmakers. And they came to me and said, this presentation is powerful, we want to make it into a film, and I started laughing. And we figured out that the first time we met in person was on June 20th, 2017. And 364 days later, on Juneteenth, 2018, we were in Town Hall Theater, just not too far from here, in front of a packed house with 7 cameras, and we filmed that presentation of Who We Are, a Chronicle of Racism in America. And for the next 3 years, we went around the country filming people whose lives intersect with different points in our history. So if you've seen the film, you know that there are some people whose lives have had some pretty remarkable events. But just to give you an example of what didn't make the film, there was a woman who was about 12 years old in Birmingham, Alabama, when the 16th Street Church was bombed. She answered the phone where the bomb threat was called in. You have 10 minutes. She hung up the phone and started walking back to the basement where the 4 girls who died were getting changed for church. The bomb went off about 10 seconds after she hung up the phone. That didn't make the film. The pastor of Mother Emanuel Church, where Dylan Roof slaughtered 9 people and injured others, sat down and talked with us about what happened in that church and the impact on his parishioners. That didn't make the film, because there is so much material that is important when you're trying to put a 400-year history into a 2-hour documentary. So what I would say is that I am incredibly proud of this film. I am proud that we made it with a group of people who were completely dedicated to telling the truth about our history. And I think that telling the truth about our history is a step, a primary step, a foundational step that we have skipped, because people like to get to the hugging part where we just hug it up and say, oh, let's all come together. But until we reckon with what brought us to this point, we will never have successful resolution. We will never have a coming together that will let America and other countries in this world head in a direction that we should be heading. So I left the ACLU in March of 2021. I left the job as a deputy legal director in charge of all of their racial justice and criminal legal reform work. And I left that job for two reasons. Number one, there were people there in their 40s who were ready for leadership. And if people like me didn't get out of the way, they weren't going to have the opportunity to take on that leadership. So it was time for me to go and let somebody else step into my role. But the other reason I left is that I became convinced, after almost 40 years as a criminal defense lawyer, that I could fix every single thing in the criminal legal system here in America. And we could let everyone out of prison. And if we didn't fix racism, we would repopulate those prisons with the exact same people in an incredibly short period of time. So there is so much work that needs to be done on this issue. The Who We Are project is taking one thing: education. One thing: making the truth about our history endemic in this country. One thing: for all the states that are passing what you have heard about so-called anti-CRT laws, trying to restrict what is taught to our children, the Who We Are project will be right in their face, because teaching our children the truth about why the country looks this way is a radical and revolutionary act. And I want to end my comments by saying this. In 1837, a quarter century before the Civil War started, John C. Calhoun, one of the most virulent racists in American history, and one of the highest position-holding politicians in American history, twice Vice President of the United States, Senator from South Carolina, I think also Governor of South Carolina. He wrote a document, and he said this: we have got to stop teaching abolition. We got to stop teaching it in the schools. We got to stop the priests from talking about it in the pulpits. And we got to stop the newspapers from writing about it. Because those three institutions are the institutions that impact the minds of the rising generation. And if they find out about abolition, slavery is done for. And he was right. He said this country will be drenched in a war, will be in a war that will drench this country in blood. And he said this 25 years before the Civil War started. What I will say, I don't want to get political because we're in the United Nations, there is a thing called the 1776 report that was put out by the last administration on the day America celebrates Martin Luther King's birthday. And they had pictures of Dr. King in that document and quotes from his "I Have a Dream" speech. And what that document said is that we have to return to patriotic education in America. If you haven't read that document, go find it. It should scare the hell out of you. The reason that I have a slightly different reaction to it is that I can see that it is already steeped in its own failure. because the effort to try and prevent us from teaching our children the truth about our history is doomed to fail. Have y'all heard of a thing called the internet? And from what I understand, 14 and 15 and 16-year-olds, they're all over it. Have you ever told a teenager you can't read something and then see how quickly they want to go read it? The attempt to suppress this information, now that the door has opened just a little bit and the truth is coming out, the attempt to suppress this information is doomed to fail. And the Who We Are Project intends to do everything we can to make that failure come as quickly as possible. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here and to speak with you all. Thank you for the work that you're doing, and I'd love to talk about the film if that's what we're going to do next. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jeff, for your introductory remarks. And I'm just thanking again our USG who does have to go. Thank you, Melissa. So we are going to be watching a few of the clips from the incredible film that Jeff not only wrote, but also is the main protagonist in, and I think many of you have seen it. And for those of you who have not seen it, we have shared the link with you. So please, the link is good until, I believe, the 21st of November, so you can still see it if you haven't seen it. And of course, it's also on Netflix, so you can see it there as well. So I think what we'll do is we'll just get right into it.
Sure.
And if I could ask our colleagues to play the first clip. Thank you.
Easter, what are the three holes that I see in these bricks?
Important to remember these people and their contributions for the same reason it's important to remember George Washington or Thomas Jefferson or anybody that signed the Declaration of Independence or anybody that fought in the war against England, because it's part of our history. It's part of who we are. And understanding that downtown Charleston, which is one of the most beautiful cities in the South, it is a tourist attraction, and one of the things that you come to understand as you go further south in this country, a lot of the buildings are made of brick. I grew up in Memphis, Tennessee, and my wife knows that I always wanted to live in a brick house because I just saw so many brick buildings, and it like reminded me of home. And these fingerprints that are in those bricks, and I just can't remember if the clip mentioned it, but Easta made it clear that those fingerprints were probably made by somebody about 6 or 7 years old, because we couldn't put our fingers into those holes. Our fingers were too big. So these were children that were building the structures that still exist in Charleston, South Carolina. And so that legacy is part of the history of our country. It's not a very pretty part of it, but it's an incredibly important part of it, because if we wipe that away, then when we come to Charleston is a beautiful city. How did it get built? There's just no answer. Oh, it was just built like, cities get built like by magic and they just appear. And so, but if we understand how Charleston was built, and then you dig a little deeper and you start to understand that many historians will say that as many as 80% of the African Americans in this country can trace their heritage to Charleston, South Carolina, because the transatlantic slave trade dumped boat after boat after boat full of enslaved people in Charleston, South Carolina. So that place has a critical history in American history, and those fingerprints on those bricks are a part of it. And I will tell you, I walked around that city and I didn't see those fingerprints. We were there. I didn't notice those fingerprints until he talked about it. And then the last 2 days we were there, I was seeing them everywhere.
Absolutely. So I think, this clip was recorded in the old Slave Mart Museum in Charleston, South Carolina, as you have said. I'd really like to hear, you've touched on it a little bit, but I'd love to delve a little bit deeper with you on this. How do you see the state of education on this chapter of our history? Do people know as much as they should about the transatlantic slave trade in enslaved Africans? And really, what would you say to people who consider this all to be, ancient history?
Well, it depends on what you mean by ancient. So the Civil War ended here in America in 1865. And for the next 90 years, separate but equal was the law of America. Separate but equal came out of the institution of slavery. And so when people say the Civil War ended all of that, it's like, well, actually it didn't. And in 1957, Dwight Eisenhower had to send 1,200 members of the 101st Airborne, one of the most vicious fighting units in the American military. He had to send them to Little Rock, Arkansas, so a couple of black kids could walk into school and sit next to white children. That was in my lifetime. So when you start saying this is ancient history, the word ancient needs to be defined. And the impact of things that happened long ago can live for centuries. And there are examples of that in every single country around the world. So I don't think it is so much that it happened so long ago. I think that's an excuse for people who don't want to wrestle with the sometimes very horrific and ugly legacy that we have here.
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the things that really struck me, in full transparency, I'm one of the producers on the film as well as working here at the United Nations, and I had the privilege of going with Jeff to a lot of these places that are happening in the film. But one of the pieces that I think you pulled out from the historical record that really hit my consciousness in a hard way. I also taught history. I taught American history before I started working here in the UN, and I think one of the things you draw out is how a lot of our history is erased, or it's marginalized, or trivialized, or just simply not taught. And one of the things that hit me was that section where, Andrew Jackson is trying to get back some of his runaway slaves. And, Andrew Jackson is a former president of this country. He sits on the $20 bill.
Yes.
So I wanted, first of all, to hear a little bit more about, his quest to retrieve his runaway slaves, and really to ask you, what are the links between featuring, a historical figure of this nature on the currency of the United States?
Well, Andrew Jackson was a very rich man, and Andrew Jackson made a lot of money for a lot of people in the United States. One of the bills that was passed during his presidency, and please listen to the name of this, the Indian Removal Act. And it did exactly what the act described. Took native people and drove them off their land so that white people could own that land, start to use it, and take the resources from that land. Andrew Jackson was a remarkable individual, and in 1803, some of his enslaved people escaped from him. And I will say that there are presidents, like our prior one and other presidents in American history, who have sung the praises of Andrew Jackson. But what they don't do is to look at who he really was. He put an article in the newspaper in 1803 saying, I got an enslaved person that escaped from me, and I want him back. And he described what he looked like. He described what he would be wearing. He described where he would probably try and go. And he said, I'll give you $50 reward, and I'll pay all expenses, and $10 extra for every 100 lashes anyone will give him, to the amount of 300. So if you found this enslaved person and your arm wasn't tired, you could get an extra $30 by giving this enslaved person 300 lashes with a whip. If your arm got tired after 200, then you'd only get an extra $20. And if you only had 100 lashes in you, you could still get an extra $10. He put this in the newspaper. And the importance of that is he did that because he knew no police officers were going to come and say, you're soliciting what looks like a murder here. There was no chance that there would be any repercussions for that, because he knew that who America was at the time was completely consistent with that kind of behavior. He wasn't ashamed of it. He was proud of it. This is who Andrew Jackson was, not somebody else. And so we put his face on the $20 bill, and that is a recognition, quite frankly, of what Andrew Jackson did for the United States. In the words of our last president, he tamed a continent. So it doesn't surprise me that his face is on the $20 bill, because much of America's wealth is tied to actions that he played a significant role in.
Yeah, thank you, Jeff, for that. So we've got a question here from the audience, and this particular question is asking if you could speak to the lack of white identity and the role of white work and consciousness in addressing systemic and internalized racism as opposed to colorblindness.
So there are a couple things to say about that, and I think many of us in this room will recognize that race is a myth, right? If you start talking to people about the human race, the racial classifications that we have come up with are ways that human beings, just one of the things that human beings have used to divide each other and to divide ourselves. But this, what I will call myth of the value of colorblindness, I think is so apparent in American society. And I said earlier that everybody wants to get to the hugging stage. Oh, let's just hug and make up and we're all good, and now we can go forward holding hands together in a loving way. But the problem with that, and the problem with colorblindness, is that it ignores the reality in the United States. And so if you want to have a government that is issuing a series of laws that mandate colorblindness, that may initially sound like that's a fantastic idea. But if you remove color from the equation, what you're doing is freezing the society in place at the moment that you institute your colorblind agenda. You're saying, I'm no longer going to look at color, and so what you're saying is, whatever distinctions color is responsible for up to this point, I'm going to ignore them. And I'm going to do it proudly, because I'll be saying I'm colorblind. and that means I'm not a racist. But if you think about it, if you have a system that is infected with racism, and then you simply decide we're going to ignore race from this point forward, you're just telling folks we are going to seal in place what generations of racism has put into place, and we're not going to look at it anymore. I will say this: colorblind politics and colorblind philosophy is very comfortable and convenient because it allows people to say, I don't see color, I'm not a racist, I love everyone. And by not seeing color, that allows you to ignore the disparities that are right in front of our eyes right now. So do I want a world where we are colorblind? You bet I do. But we got to do a little bit of work before we can get there.
Yeah, I think that's really insightful, Jeff. And I just wondered, another piece that I think is so strong in your film is where you break down what your definition of racism is. And I just wondered if you would like to share that with this audience as well.
Yeah, you know, I think as a lawyer, I made my living with words. And so you understand that words have power, and specific words have specific power. And so I want to talk about racism in the United States, because what I'm going to say does not apply worldwide. Worldwide, anybody in this room can be a racist. It depends on where you live and what the culture and power structure in your country is. But from my definition, I cannot be a racist in the United States of America. I can be the most prejudiced person in any room I walk into. There is no question about that. But I can't be a racist because racism is more than prejudice. And when people equate those two things, racism and prejudice, as the same thing, what it allows them to do is to dismiss all kinds of factual history. Because if I don't have any prejudice in my heart, then I'm not a racist and I don't have to worry about it. The whole problem just goes away. Racism is prejudice plus social power plus legal authority. You have to have the social power and the legal authority to enforce your prejudice on a community or a country before it can become racism. And that's why I can't be a racist in the United States of America, because black people in this country have never had social power or legal authority. That's true when we were brought here as enslaved people. It was true during the Civil Rights Movement, and it was true when Barack Obama was in the White House. So until black Americans have social power and legal authority to enforce our individual prejudices on our entire country, don't call us racist. And so using the word is important, and understanding what you mean by the word is important, because there's so many times where I see people having a conversation and everybody is using the term racist and they are using it in different ways. And so one thing I would encourage people to do in conversations with someone, when the word comes up, what is it that you mean when you use that word? And you may find that people are talking about something that's different than what's in your head, especially if you have that conversation in the United States.
Thank you so much, Jeff. I think we'll go on to our next clip, please.
Still, after 21 years now, we still, as UN member states, cannot come to a consensus on proper recognition of the truth that is our history. And in our plight as Jamaica and several other countries within this institution, in our plight towards reparatory justice, we have sought to employ a similar approach to educate and to control the narrative, but to really educate those about the history and not just to call for what we feel entitled to, but to create a better understanding and a more, I want to say, well-received environment, a warmer environment for conversation. But I ask you, in your experience, in cases where we are basically at a standstill in some cases within this multilateral context on the issue of really recognizing and properly acknowledging the role states play and the role they can play in righting their wrongs, what do you suggest at this particular point in terms of what we can do tangibly in properly addressing and giving it its due diligence, giving it the due priority that we should be? It's enough to speak about it, but you can understand our frustration as we live the experience every day.
Absolutely.
So I was just hoping that you'd be able to shed some light and some insight and guidance as you have done so far in educating us about racism in America. Thank you.
Thank you for that question. And I want to be clear that I am rolling around in the mud with everybody else, trying to figure out, like, what is the right answer to this. And there are a couple of things that I think I want to say. You are right that education by itself is not enough. One of the things that I think about when I think about my understanding of the history of the United States and Jamaica, if people had to confront what we actually did in terms of the existence of the people on that island, if we actually had to look at the facts, there are people who would literally throw up. There are people who would be horrified. And so part of what I believe is that while this information is becoming much more broadly known, there are still people that are so ignorant of it. And quite frankly, it's easy to be ignorant of it because all you have to do is, like, turn your head or switch the channel when something comes on and you can just avoid it. So I have been moved by things written by a man named William Burroughs. He's an American author who wrote a book in 1960 called Naked Lunch. I am not recommending that anybody read this book. It is one of the most difficult books you will ever read about drug addiction, childhood sexual abuse. The images in this book are disturbing. But when William Burroughs was asked, what does the title mean, Naked Lunch? He said, it's that moment when everyone has to look at what's really on the end of everybody's fork. And we need a naked lunch moment with white supremacy on this planet as it has impacted both the United States, Jamaica, and other countries around the world. One of the reasons you see so much resistance in the United States to this kind of education, I think there are something like 35 of the 50 states that have some kind of law trying to restrict what you can teach. The reason that people are doing that is because they understand, even if it's at a subliminal level, that making this knowledge endemic will make a difference. And if it doesn't make a difference with us, it's going to make a difference with our children. It's going to make a difference with the minds of the rising generation who are not tied into all the bullshit, quite frankly, pardon my French, that our generation and the generations that have come before us are tied up with. When you start talking to 14 and 15 and 16-year-olds about this stuff, they get it. And they're not going to want to participate in it. And their turn is going to come when change will happen. So I believe that the United States, and quite frankly, our planet, I believe that on the issue of racial justice, we're at a tipping point. And that tipping point is not something that is defined by an event or even a year. A tipping point in countries with the long histories and legacies like the ones on this planet, a tipping point can be 2 decades. And I said in this film, on the stage presentation in 2018, America is at a tipping point. And we are at the exact same tipping point today that we were at in 2018. And the question has not been resolved which way we're going to roll. Have y'all looked at the election results from the midterms? And you see the literal tipping point that America is at? So for me, and I'm not saying this is the only answer, because I think it has to be a multifaceted answer, but for me, the one thing that I know that we have never had in the existence of this planet on the issue of racism, we have never had that naked lunch moment. And we are starting to have it now. But we have never had that moment. And what I want to find out is what will happen if a generation of Americans, let's just limit it to this country for a minute, if a generation of people in the United States grow up knowing the truth about anti-black racism in this country and how it has impacted this country, what would happen if they grew up knowing that and having a chance to do something about it? So I think that, as you say, it's so frustrating when you're trying to educate people and it's not coming to the result that you want. It's not bringing the action that you want to come from the education. All I would say is don't abandon the education, because that has been the one thing that is missing from every single attempt that we have made as a planet to address these issues. We have never reckoned with the truth about what brought all of us together in a world that looks like it does today. And until we do that, I don't think we have a chance to make it better. I wish I could give you a better answer, but that's all I've got. And I would love to talk with you about other ideas that you or other people in this room may have, because this is no one organization or no one person that's going to fix this. I will be dead and rotting in the ground, and this issue is still going to be alive, and it will need to be addressed, which is one of the reasons I am so focused on who's coming next and the rising generation, because they are going to be a part of fixing what we haven't fixed.
Thank you, Jeff. All right, well, I think many of you have been able to complete the survey, so I would just like to ask everyone to join in giving Jeff a huge round of applause. Thank you, Jeff Robinson of the Who We Are Project and Film.